Hopefully what we will be able to do is identify the methodology towards handling a crisis, but most importantly, if I had one message from today, it would be about ensuring that you are prepared ahead of a crisis, and that after the crisis is gone, you then move forwards and look to recover from it as well. Too often, crisis communications is focused purely on the moment of a crisis, and actually, in order to have a resilient reputation, we need to have a lot more thought about what goes before and what comes after every crisis that arises. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. The methodology I'm going to talk to you about today offers a little bit is some reassurance that in the middle of that storm, you can find a way forward, and that can be very, very rewarding and satisfying. I don't ever belittle any issue I've dealt with for any client, I always have to qualify that comment about it being fun. But at the same time, I'm very clear that if we do communications in the right way and we build a resilient reputation for a business, then actually it's a really rewarding experience managing the reputation through a crisis. You have to keep learning and adapting. So the way the communications landscape has changed and the way that cultural landscape has changed is changing how we do crisis communications. So now you see a real key opportunity to actually impact any crisis in the first 3 to 4 hours. Fundamentally, you normally have about 3 hours before media starts reporting about it. Within 24 hours, it's everywhere. And actually, one of the problems you have, for example, around search, is that once it's everywhere, you can't stop it being everywhere. So you have a real challenge. For example, I worked for a client for a long time who had a particular fire linked to their product. Tragically, someone died, and it was the major story on the BBC website. The real challenge for them was that it stayed the major story when you Googled their name for 3 years. So when you Google, to be fair, you had to Google that and fire or that and something else, but it was pretty easy within 2 clicks to suddenly just be reminded of this great tragedy. And that causes a real problem for your company. And the reason was that their response to the crisis was very, very poor. And that's why they brought us in, because they realised they're not responding in the right way, they're not being quick enough. So they had to come and get external support to actually rebuild the brand and recover as a company. The other problem we have is that anyone can publish it. So I mentioned the Tylenol example. I said perhaps someone will say I'm being poisoned. It's not just about something as simple as something as tragic as that. You've also got the situation where people just do silly things against a company because they can. So this is a really good example, which I haven't got the link, but basically if you Google United Brake Guitars, essentially it's a guy whose guitar got broken by United Airlines. And the last time I looked, it was about 13 million views. I'm sure it's got a lot more now. And it's just a case of, some quite amusing content about a very, sadly, quite common issue, which is someone's goods being damaged in transit. That happens, if you're an airline, we work with British Airways. Every day, British Airways fly millions of passengers every day. So, of course, even if it's 1 in a million chance that your luggage is going to be lost, that still means that there's probably 3 or 4 items of luggage a day being lost, just because that's the nature of these huge organisations. The problem is, whereas previously you could call up and say, I'm terribly sorry, we'll give you some vouchers, we'll do this, we're really apologetic. Now someone can send a video up online and get 13 million hits for criticising you for it. So suddenly your reputation is on the line, rather than just an unfortunate incident. So what are the sort of crises that we face? I mean, there's a whole lot here, and I won't go through the whole list. I'll send the slides around for those who wish it afterwards, and you can look to identify them. But some classic examples are, as a category issue, a consumer issue. So when we talk about category issue, often, and this is one of the hardest challenges in PR, I think, working with clients at least. Sometimes, for example, I work with a white goods manufacturer, produces fridges and washing machines. Every single washing machine has the same fault. They all have the same problem for old problems. And it took me a while to persuade that client that just because everyone else has the problem doesn't mean they shouldn't address it. Because there's a kind of sometimes a view of, well, we don't want to be the first people who have felt responsible. But if you're going to be an ethical and responsible company, you have a responsibility to communicate. And even if you're just from a cynical point of view, if you don't address it and you get found to have not addressed it, then you're in real problems. So things like competitor threats are the sort of crisis triggers that really can cause problems, because often you feel as though it's not something you're going to need to focus on. Others can be completely out of your control. A terrorist attack. Think of poor BP did you see that tragic terrorist incident in Algeria about 18 months ago? There was a big attack on the oil rig. About 50 of BP's workers were taken hostage, and most died. BP had no part in that. They had no knowledge of it, didn't know what was going to happen. It wasn't about BP, it was just about oil. It was just something that they got dragged into, but they still have to respond. And actually one of the issues around these crisis triggers is the things you can't necessarily do very much about. However, there are others that you can do something about, or so much as often you cause yourself. And they're the sort of more internal crisis triggers. So, for example, stock performance can become a real issue that you have to deal with as a corporation. Management change, just firing people, that can be a big thing. You get rid of your CEO, how do you respond to that? It might be a investigation because of bad practice. I don't know if you guys have followed this at all, but in the UK right now, not a month goes by that there isn't a new bank that has been attacked for some sort of impropriety. They're now at £40 billion worth of fines from the UK government for things like mis-selling, for various different structural mistakes, and for potentially helping the financial crisis come. So there is a huge issue for these things, which are about following investigations and lawsuits. Also environmental issues. I mean, there's Carolina, who's speaking in another session, has talked a lot, and I talk to her regularly around this issue of making sure we are as good as we can be as a company in our environmental practice. Because if we're not, then we can face some real challenges from a communications point of view. And some of these internal triggers often will not be a direct result of a decision you've made, but certainly something that you've sparked. Labour dispute, another one. You might have decided that as a company, we can't afford to increase wages. But what ends up happening is you have a strike. How do you deal with a strike? Well, communications is the answer. So, from my point of view, I think it's important to remember what are the ones that really matter. And this is just one way to think about it. The truth is that there's millions of different ways that crises can occur, and endless ways that this challenge can come to you. But if you just take a very specific look at stock price and the impact that a particular issue can have on a company's share price, it's interesting to see how the longevity of corporate issues. So if you look at this, the markets can quickly be moved back if it's a corporate issue. On an operational level, they're the ones that have the long-term impact. From a communications point of view, have the most risk, the most damage. And the reason for that is that actually, it goes back to the Tylenol example. It's all about how the business responds. So a communications challenge, which is how I take the corporate bucket to mean, can often end up being resolved quickly. Operational issues require companies to take serious business decisions. And one thing I'll keep coming back to in my presentation is, unless you respond in the right way, then you will not solve the crisis. It's not just about sending out a good press release. It's so much more than that. Fundamentally, a business needs to make business decisions when a crisis erupts. However, where communications and PR consultants come in, where you guys come in, is in trying to earn understanding, earn support, and influence opinion and behaviour. And one thing I think is really important, and we touched upon this in the session I attended earlier, is about, for that to happen, that's both internal and external. So you need to influence opinion of how the business responds. And for that to happen, PR needs to have a seat at the top table. We discussed, didn't we, earlier, about how whether PR sort of managers are given enough authority within a business to say this things need to happen, these things do. In terms of crisis response, it's absolutely integral that you guys are right in the middle of decision making, because you can only earn understanding and support externally if you've also influenced the decisions and behaviour internally. So I think that's an important point. Having said that, the day-to-day job is then to influence the opinion and behaviour of journalists, of social media users, of various people you're communicating to, the general public. So, with this point in mind, I just want to think about the influence and what that means. Have you guys seen this slide before? Yeah? Oh, damn. All right, so marketing is, if the marketing challenge is say who I'm a great lover, advertising will tell you I'm a great lover, I'm a great lover, I'm a great lover. PR, however, see? So for PR, the idea is that we're trying to get others to tell that story. And that's where I think the Mexico example is a really good. I'm going to leave that for a little while. I just want to leave that image, you know. But I think there's a really good thing about trying to use others to tell the story where possible. And that's what influence is, really. It's about trying to address an issue, yes, but also try to earn your right to be heard and get others to tell your story for you. And that's why a lot of what I'm going to talk about shortly is really around trying to communicate to the wider audience and then share beyond that. So telling journalists, yes. Telling social media users, yes. Telling your friends as well. But having a consistent story that can be spread across all those channels. Because if you do that, you can address a crisis quickly and you can move beyond the crisis as quickly as possible. We talk in the 4 R's. So the first stage is about readiness. The second about having radar. The third about response, and the fourth about recovery. They are very much an actual ongoing process. What I would say is any crisis and any issue can come at you can join any stage of it. It is linear in that in any ideal world, you would be ready for it. You would be keeping your radar up for the issue to come. You would then respond to it and you'd be able to recover from it. And it would happen in that order. But the world doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, you get brought on board to help with recovering for a brand when they're 6 months down the line from a crisis. Or you get told 2 days, 1 day after this horrible news story's appeared, oh, can you come into a meeting? I need to get your help with this thing. Like, what the hell? We weren't ready for this. But it happens. And that's the way of the world. So what we try and do is say, for every good crisis management model, you would go all the way through the process. But in the real world, we just help where we can. And hopefully the methodology helps you respond in the right way at the right time. So I'm going to spend some time now going through these individual steps and just giving you a bit of an example of what they are. So each step has certain tools, and I think the lights are a little difficult to read, but fundamentally, I won't go on every single one, but again, any questions at the end of this section, very happy to talk about specific products. But at Ogilvy, we have issues like an influence mapping process or a preliminary messaging framework, which we do as part of the readiness section. So we identify the vulnerabilities early, and then we have tools that clients can use in order to be ready for a crisis that comes. We then employ what we call radar, which is essentially being on top of any growing issues. I mentioned to the colleague there about how if you have 24/7 monitoring and you use some automatic processes that we have, you're able to actually flag when a crisis might be brewing. At the same time, you also need to be tracking key opinion former views. One of the things that I heard in the session about communications in Armenia earlier, which I thought was very interesting and very true globally, was that journalists tend to write stories that other journalists think are important. There's a little bit of a sort of echo chamber, does that make sense? So this journalist says, I'm really exercised about this issue. This journalist goes, you know what, I've been hearing this issue is really big, I need to write about it. And so for a brand, keeping on top of what those issues are is very important. Asking the questions of journalists, using your media relations is key. And similarly, for social media influencers, if you at Coke have have someone who's a really big fan of Coke, but sometimes posts negative comments, then you want to be just keeping an eye out on what they're saying. So the recovery stage is so important. And similarly, the preparedness stage is also really important. So one of the things I want to talk about in detail is really how can you be ready? how can you stay on top of it? Yes, how you respond, and I know there'll be some questions about some tips on that, but then also how you can start to recover. So, readiness. What is readiness? It's getting the right resources and people in place. Now, a colleague there asked, how do you know what an issue is? What's the difference between a major moment versus long bubbling issues? Well, my answer to that is, this is what this phase is about. Keep ready, right? So, we would always, when brought in as a potential corporate communications partner, would always look to do a risk review, an assets review, and then come to some actual outputs of understanding and agreement on these three things. That is, what are the existing and potential challenges? What are the precedents set by previous challenges? And what are the possible approaches to navigating future challenges? And there's lots of ways of talking about this, but fundamentally, it's an audit, right? It's doing I know Rafi in the session in the main room earlier talked about a SWOT, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. That works, a SWOT works, an audit works, a risk review and an assets review works. Call it what you want. The key thing is, ask yourselves, what are the challenges that this brand or company might face, and what do we need to do to be ready to face that challenge? And I tell you, from having worked on this for many, many years in the corporate space and in politics, only once probably have I directly predicted a situation that would actually happen. But you can usually get 90% there. So it might be that you predict that a certain product is going to have a problem, and that product's fine, but a sister product does have the problem. And so all the language you prepared, all the sort of crisis communication toolkit you prepared for that product, you can cut and paste into this one, and then you have to tweak a little bit. And tweaking is important, because in the middle of a crisis, if you have something that's 90% of the answer, you've saved yourself 90% of the time to start addressing other issues. And that's really important. I think there's also about mapping scenarios. So we go through a 3-stage process, which is identifying, we literally put on a wall all these different questions and say, is this a red issue, an amber issue, or a green issue? So where does it fit in terms of likelihood of occurrence or challenge of reputation? So the truth is, anything that is very highly likely to happen and very damaging, you should already know about. You should already be ready for. And I hope most of you in day-to-day PR managers will be. Where I think the sitting back and doing a vulnerabilities audit is really helpful is probably more in this space. So has a very high impact, but is also quite likely, if that makes sense. So I think that kind of amber area is where I would generally spend quite a bit of time working with clients and trying to work out, so yes, we have an issue with smoking and people think smoking is bad, but what's quite likely to happen and quite damaging? What about if someone we used in advertising dies of lung cancer, for example? It's a good little thing where it's not, it could happen. It'd be sad, obviously, if it does, but you know that your brand will get a lot of criticism personally about that issue. So you can prepare a statement for that sort of eventuality. Similarly, with Tylenol, after everything that Tylenol's been through, you can bet Johnson & Johnson has thought about the high likelihood of tampering with all their products. But actually, it very rarely happens. So in a way, the Tylenol thing is probably somewhere around here. So the idea of Tylenol being poisoned again was very unlikely, but it kind of did happen. So fortunately, they were ready for it. And then when you've done that, you start looking at mitigation and what are the things that are manageable versus the things that are avoidable. Ideally, so as well as being ready for a response that might come, you also want to actually put in place changes. And it's amazing how much time I spend actually analysing risks that companies face and realising, well, hang on, if you're saying that's a problem and you're saying the solution is this, we don't need a crisis to solve that. Just go solve it. And suddenly you find that you actually are able to make the changes before a crisis arises. So you can change a business just by doing a communications audit, by looking at what a challenge might be. And it's a really quite rewarding opportunity. One of the things I really love about doing the crisis comms is when you go in and say, but hang on, this is a particular challenge that if you just made these 2 changes, you could make happen, and that challenge won't happen. And they go, oh yeah, let's do that. It's brilliant. So the output can even be something that you actually avoid a risk that the company itself has identified as being challenging. The other step, I think, in preparation is about making sure you have the right team in place. I touched on this earlier. I think it's really important that corporate communications are at the heart of any crisis response. I think the PR manager needs to be working alongside the marketing team, but also the legal team and any customer services team, because when a crisis happens, they all need to work together to make a decision and a recommendation to the CEO on a big issue. Now, what matters here in terms of the preparation stage is that if you don't even know who the legal person is, you don't know how to pull them together. And if we talk about having 3 hours maybe to address an issue, how can you do that if you don't even know the right customer service person for this product? So you've identified it as highly likely that this product could have a problem. You've identified that you need to work with legal and customer services. Then the right thing to do is to get together a call sheet, literally write down their number, point down where they sit in the office, introduce yourself to them. So you say, by the way, if a crisis happens, I might be running down the hall at you. And that's really important. These things matter. And again, if you're ready for a problem, you can respond quicker and better. And that's the key thing. There's a few other things that we can do in the readiness phase. I'm conscious of time, so I'll be quick on this. First is testing. So media training is a very important thing. Make sure that as well as identifying vulnerabilities, you've also got your spokespeople ready for how they would handle such an issue. Similarly, social media response. We often, when we do an audit, we would identify the right way to respond to with a press release about, there's been this issue, we've taken these steps, etc. What we're increasingly doing, and what you must do now, is also work out what that is in 140 characters, work out what the Facebook content will be, work out how to respond to social media influencers. Make sure that's ready, because if you have it on the shelf, you can bring it down and it makes everyone's lives easier. In the biggest stages as well, you can also do a full crisis rehearsal, which, by the way, is really fun, because if your boss is sort of recognises that they could have problems and that kind of stuff, putting them under the pressure of a crisis really tests their mettle, and it's fun. And they recognise they recognise why they need corporate communications help. I'll tell you that much. So, anyway, radar. So I'll be very quick on this one. Fundamentally, it's about using listening techniques to be on top of any upcoming issues. So it's impossible to ever know all the issues that a company or a brand might face. So the most important thing is that you're monitoring and you're alive to it. Simple things like Google alerts, always very useful. But also, I think there's an importance to try and use whatever information you can to try and get ahead of a problem. Now, this slide is actually quite hard to see, unfortunately, I think. But essentially, if you look at it over time, the earlier you can actually preemptively address an issue, the quicker it goes away. The truth is, if you take till too late, it becomes a crisis management issue. And this is actually the point I was making earlier about a slide. Late detection will mean that you're actually already on the back foot, and you have to respond in a much more fuller and actually, frankly, more expensive way. It takes more resources, more time, and more issues. So if you can be on top of the issue, then you can get it dealt with quicker. Now, in terms of how you evaluate that threat, we have a few little tools. One thing is about looking at the message, and the second is looking at the influence. So think about what the content is, and then think about how influential that content is. And for some clients, we have a really, really complicated way of looking at this. So this is for a big FMCG brand, and we literally have a score of, I think it's out of 20. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, it's 20. So there's 5 issues of each of it. If it's a high challenge, it gets 3 points. If it's a medium challenge, it gets 2. If it's a low, it gets 1. So 5 things, 5 points. It's up to 25 points you get. So we actually analysed the social media commentary, we analysed the media commentary, and we were actually able to say, this is a 20-point issue, this is a 16-point issue, this is a 8-point issue, let's not worry about it. And it actually gives you a little bit, that methodology gives you quite a nice little kind of reassurance in the middle of a crisis as to, this is really quite insignificant, or, you know what, it's probably okay. The truth is, all these things are quite subjective. I mean, even the way that, how do you actually judge that how emotive an issue is? It says that the high 3 points there is that extremely sensitive topic, likely to inspire widespread alarm. Well, what I think is widespread alarm might be different to what you think is widespread alarm. So this is only really a guide rather than a sort of a mathematical way of looking at these things. As ever with PR and communications, there's as much art as there is science, I think. But the truth is, if you've got a little bit of scientific methodology, it makes you much better placed to respond. So then on the response time, I'm conscious of time. So on the response, I think time is everything. If you delay communications until you know everything, you'll never say anything. And I think the key challenge here is making sure that you're able to respond in a quick and effective manner. What we see in terms of the response to a crisis is if you go to your boss and say, we've got an issue, they'll probably give you one of these 4 answers. This can't be happening. It's not us, it's nothing to do with us. Why me? It's really unfair. It's just so terrible. Let's make it go away. Let's pay for some media to do it. Let's just try and close down the issue. Or finally, I guess we can't fight it. We may as well just deal with it, I suppose. I mean, this is true of life, by the way. It's not just about a crisis issue. I mean, my wife and I have similar conversations quite regularly. But the truth is, if you're dealing with a crisis, you need to try and get them to the acceptance stage as quickly as possible. Because if you're in denial or if you're just angry about a subject, you can't make good decisions. And that's the key thing about a response. Accept that you're in the middle of the problem you've got, and then go and make the right decisions about how to deal with it. So the best practice in terms of responding to it is actually doing a multiple different things. You've got to understand what's going on, as well as actually behave in the right way. So you've got to take charge of what's happening. I think there's also some issues around action. Like, so much is done in crisis comms response, which doesn't actually deliver a business change. And if I could say any advice in terms of a crisis response, words will only go so far. You need to take action and show you're doing proper activity and really nailing the issue that's been addressed. Sometimes you can't do anything, and in that case, what you're only really doing is understanding and behaviour, and that's giving you some control. So you're able to do some positive elements, but fundamentally, to get really best practice, you need to do all 3 elements. Does that make sense? Okay. So very quickly, because we have about a minute left. So first 30 minutes, listen and learn. So in a crisis, especially the crisis you prepared for, actually, in a crisis, you can very quickly just jump and just say, right, I know what to say here, I know what to say, write down the press release, let's go. That's the wrong thing to do. Sit back, accept that you've got the problem, and be really, really thoughtful about what the challenge is. If you listen and learn, you'll respond better later. And to that reason, think about your audience, right? In particular, if you're dealing with a potential media crisis or a social media issue, right? Why is it going to be a crisis? Because people love this shit. I mean, genuinely, right? If it's got something to do with tragedy or a massive cock-up, it sells papers. It makes people want to retweet, right? So in the first 30 minutes, think about all those challenges, things that is going to make someone read this story, and make sure you're addressing what the challenge is. Because if you just jump to communicate what you want to communicate, you won't actually close off the issue. In the first hour, though, you still need to start acting quickly. So the 3 things to remember here are to provide an initial strategic approach, to remember that the strategy has to evolve, and then agree on the initial strategy. Crises are so fast-moving; it's very hard to be on top of everything. But you need to have a clear set of directions, and within that first hour, you need to have really settled down and gone, you know what? This is where the direction we need to go. These are the steps we need to take. And along the way, you'll kink left and right because that's the nature of these things. But if you don't agree initial strategy within an hour, you're in real problems. Because then you can't get the plan signed off in order to actually take action, show understanding, and actually change behaviour. What that looks like can be many things. Here's a rather complicated version that we've done as a kind of example template. But think about all your audiences, think about what their attitude is going to be around it, think about how influential they are, and what their response can be. If within an hour and a half you can get agreement that these are the challenges you're facing, then, and these are the issues you're facing, very quickly you can move to solutions. You can already get into the delivery phase of actually delivering those solutions within 2 hours. Suddenly your 3-hour window doesn't look so scary. You can actually move towards it, but only if you're asking yourself all those questions and doing that listening. The final thing I would say in the response phase is that it's really important that you actually close it down. I don't know how many people here have actually been in a genuine crisis, felt like really under the issue, under the cosh, as I would say in English. Yeah, a few, right? So, as an example, right?
Every day.
Yeah. It says more about, yeah. But what I would say is, when you're in that situation, one of the most important things psychologically for everyone in your business is to actually sit back and go, we're actually out of it. You know what? It's so important because when you're in crisis mode, it's crazy and it's mental and you're doing all these things and that adrenaline is pumping. One of the things that are exciting about a crisis is that moment. But you can't live like that. And I've worked for some brands that have lots of issues and sometimes it feels like you are living like that. But unless you genuinely sit down and go, right, we're reviewing the problems, but we think it's time to close down. It's time to move from red down to amber. It doesn't work because in the end, you'll start making the bad decisions because you're just in continuous crisis mode. You've agreed on your strategy, you've built out a plan to do it, you've executed that plan, and your radar is showing you that it's starting to dissipate. That's the moment where you take a step back. But that doesn't mean the job's done. That's when you have to go into recovery. And the recovery phase is something that I think is very often overlooked. And it's a real shame that businesses don't do enough in... Every business is willing to invest in a crisis, right? An issue crops up in your company. They'll give you all the resources you need to address that issue today. The question is, what is the damage that has been done? And how can we recover as a business going forwards? And that's something that, for example, one of my clients, BP, has done really well. BP saw that the Gulf of Mexico spill as a massive issue for their reputation. It wasn't that, the operational issues there were mostly not their fault as it happens, but they were the ones who got all the huge reputational damage. And so what do? Well, they invested in their Olympic sponsorship, and they were the sponsors of London 2012. And they did a lot of work in the UK and the US in particular to actually invest in advertising and PR and try and turn perceptions about BP from being very, very negative to just being better. You're not going to get it to a wonderful world of milk and honey, but they've really invested in actually, for example, a social media feed that Ogilvy set up for BP, and we worked with them in getting going. When they first started, it was 70% negative. Within 18 months of proactive communication and PR around the Olympics, it was 70% positive. And that's a real, that's because they were willing to invest and willing to take time working over it. And that's the problem. Too often, companies think that the issue is now over. They can move on. They can't move on. They need to invest and take time and resources in the same way that they were willing to do during the crisis as they would for the longer term. A few tips for that. I think the first one is establish the basis of future trust. It's particularly if you've come in late to the process and you haven't done, for example, a benchmark on what your reputation is. It's hard to know what good looks like. It's very hard to say, well, at the moment our brand gets a negative sentiment of 10%. We want to get it to plus 10. Well, why? It's difficult. But within the organisation, you need to make a decision. What is your ambition? Because you win or lose. Fundamentally, you can go and either you'll get to 10% or you won't. But you've got to keep trying and you've got to try and win. I think you also need to demonstrate change. One of the most important things I keep coming back to is about making sure that as a company, we are addressing these challenges and we're doing business decisions. When you have taken those business decisions, then for the love of God, don't stop talking about them. You've got to make sure you've explained that you've learnt from this process and that you've addressed this issue. So you saw about the Mexico case study. What did we do? We went out on the airwaves and kept saying, look, we're tackling this problem, but also the problem, you need to understand the problem is not as big as you think it is. It's really important that you keep communicating, and even though it's counterintuitive sometimes to repeat a negative, you've still got to address the issue and show that you've changed as a business.